Hello and welcome friends to this session on Industrial Policy 1991. You would recall that we've already had a discussion on the Industrial Policy 1956, and now it is the time for us to discuss the 1991 Industrial Policy, which is also known as the New Economic Policy, NEP, or New Industrial Policy, NIP. What was the reason that an industrial policy had to be unveiled in 1991, since the last Industrial Policy 1980 was only a decade back, and the governments which were at the center both in 1980 and 1991 belonged to the same party, Congress I, having the same philosophy. So what was the reason that a new industrial policy had to be unveiled in 1991, only 11 years after the 1980 industrial policy? This was basically necessitated by the BOP crisis that the government was facing, the country was facing right since 1990. The crisis had grown into such a big proportion. The crisis had grown so much that we had to even mortgage our gold with the International Monetary Fund, and we had to seek assistance from IMF. So to seek assistance, we had to mortgage our gold with IMF. You know that we have discussed this in international business. This IMF is meant for providing assistance to countries suffering from BOP crisis, facing BOP crisis. So we went to IMF and we asked for help. And to provide us help, they actually gave us some conditions which we had to comply with. So there were some conditionalities attached with the loans that were provided by IMF so that we can tackle our BOP crisis. We have talked about the conditionalities which the IMF and the World Bank attached to their loans. Same thing happened with us here in India also, and it was this pressure from IMF that made us open up our economy in the 1990s, and for which it was very much required at that point of time to unveil a new approach to the industrial sector and to come up with a new industrial policy. So basically, the genesis was in the BOP crisis that we had to face, because of which we had to mortgage our gold and seek IMF assistance. To provide us assistance, IMF readily provided us with assistance, but they also attached some conditions with their assistance, and to comply with those conditions we had to change our approach towards industries, towards the businesses, and this new approach towards industries was actually documented in the 1991 industrial policy. Then there was another reason. There was a lot of political instability at the center. There was not a strong government at that point of time at the center. The last elections had taken place within the last 3 years. 2 general elections had taken place. 1 general election and 1 midterm election has basically taken place, and there were 3 prime ministers in a span of 2.5 years that the country saw. So there was a lot of political instability at the center. So this again necessitated an altogether new industrial policy. There were uncertain times, and we needed to have, the governments of the day needed to have a clear-cut approach towards the industries, and that was why this industrial policy was unveiled in 1991. And at that point of time, as I said already, the ruling government belonged to Congress I, and at that point of time Mr. Pamulpati Venkatesh Narasimha Rao, Mr. P.V. Narasimha Rao was the Prime Minister of the country, and Dr. Manmohan Singh, who then went on to become the Prime Minister of the country in 2004, at that point of time was the Finance Minister. And largely it is credited to these two gentlemen. The industrial policy of 1991 is credited to these two gentlemen. However, there were so many bureaucrats, so many academicians, so many experts who were involved in drafting the industrial policy, which was unveiled in 1991. Industrial policy 1991 basically is known for 3 important features, and that is why it is also sometimes referred to as the LPG policy, the Liberalization, Privatization and Globalization policy. Liberalization meant freeing the industrial sector from bureaucratic control. Up till 1991, there were requirement of lots of licenses. If you want to operate in a particular sector, you have to first go and seek license from the government. We have discussed how government even restricted the quantity of production in these enterprises. They might belong to private sector, public sector, but the volume of production was restricted by the government. Not only this, how the products would be distributed, that was also regulated by the government. So these regulations, these restrictions were lifted off in 1991, and this lifting off of restrictions and bureaucratic control is basically known as liberalization. Up till 1991, there was this phenomenon of Inspector Raj and License Raj, which meant that companies will have to seek license for whatever they do, and there would be a lot of inspections, which means the bureaucratic machinery would inspect the premises of the various business entities to check whether they are abiding by the conditions specified in the license or not. So in 1991, when the new industrial policy was unveiled, it actually did away with these kind of restrictive regulations, these kind of license Raj and this kind of permit Raj, and it liberalized the Indian economy. So this was the liberalization aspect of the LPG in 1991. Then we had globalization and privatization also. Privatization basically meant the selling off of loss-making PSUs. Loss-making PSUs were a big drain on the government exchequer. They were consuming a lot of resources, and they were not able to earn anything for the government, and they were not even able to perform very efficiently and to be very productive. So it was thought that the ones which are not able to make any profits, the ones which are loss-making public sector enterprises, they would be sold off, either partially, which means part of the ownership of the government would be sold off to private enterprises, or completely, which would mean the whole PSU would be sold off to the private enterprises. So this was the privatization element of the industrial policy 1991. And then the industrial policy also talked about globalization. Globalization meant integrating more closely with the global market, integrating more closely with the other countries by relaxing restrictions on cross-border movement of goods. So it was made easier for the goods to move across the borders, to flow out of the country and to flow in the country, which meant the exports as well as the imports were liberalized, the restrictions were lifted off. It was also made possible for the firms operating in India to import new technologies, cutting edge technologies, because naturally India was never at that point of time known for its research and development expertise. So whatever new technologies were developed in foreign countries, we had to import them, and this import of technology was made much more easier in 1991. Not only this, the government also lifted off its restriction from movement of skilled personnel from foreign countries specifically into India. So we used to receive highly skilled individuals from across the world, specifically from the developed part of the world, to India, so that they can come here and they can help out the firms which have been established here. And many times they were recruited by the firms operating in India for some requirement which they were not able to fulfill with the resources available here in India. So this movement of skilled personnel was also allowed in 1991. Not only this, the flow of finance across the border was also liberalized. It was easier now for Indian firms to obtain finance from abroad, and that is why this particular aspect is known as globalization. It basically helped India integrate more closely with the global world, with the global economy, and that is why it is known as globalization. So these three were the main aspects of the 1991 industrial policy. Now we are moving on to specific provisions of industrial policy. Let us have a look at the provisions as far as the public sector is concerned. The role of public sector enterprises was limited. So there was a contraction in the role that the public sector enterprises played till then, and more space was left open for the private sector play. So this was one major direction which the industrial policy 1991 took. And the role of public sector enterprises was limited to strategically important goods like defense equipments, essential goods required for infrastructure. For example, you can name coal. Coal is very, very important because still in India most of our power production is thermal power production, which means that we use coal to produce power, and without power, without electricity, you cannot run your industries, you cannot run your machines, and that is why it can be considered to be an essential infrastructure good. Again, oil exploration, harnessing of oil and mineral resources. Mineral resources means the various kinds of iron ore, which are various kinds of mineral ores which are there, from which after purification we receive various minerals. We obtain various minerals. So the exploration means searching for, looking for, and then once you have found out some oil, you have found out some mineral, then you have to harness it, then you have to basically process it further. So the crude oil will have to be processed into refinery products, petrol, diesel, and the mineral ores, they have to be processed into metals. So iron ore, for example, hematite has to be processed into iron, and then it has to be further processed into steel. So these kind of processes, they were left open for the public sector play. Those areas which were crucial for the economic development, they were also delegated to the public sector, so that the public sector enterprise could develop these areas and contribute to the development of the country. And areas where there was inadequate private sector investment, those were also kept reserved for the public sector. These were sectors which required a lot of investment, and wherein the projects used to have a very long gestation period. So they were also kept for public sector play. Let's have a look at the industries which were retained for the public sector. Earlier, the number of industries which were reserved for the public sector was much more. Now they were limited to 8. There were only 8 industries which were retained for the public sector. In the rest of the industries, the private sector was allowed. So I have actually shown you the 6 industries which are there. Basically, I have not actually mentioned all 8 of them. You do not need to cram them up. The basic idea that you need to have in your mind is that, see, these are very, very strategically very important industries, be it arms and ammunitions and defense equipments. By that time, 91, we had already seen 3 wars, 48, 62 and 65 and 71. So basically 4 wars we had seen by them, and that was why defense equipments were strategically very important for the country. Again, atomic energy. At that point of time, we were using atomic energy for peaceful civilian use. We were not developing any atomic weapons at that point of time, but still it was very, very important for the economy. Again, railways, which requires a lot of investment, and the private sector cannot be expected to invest that much. So these kind of sectors were reserved for the public sector enterprises. Then the mineral oil and coal, as I said, very, very important from infrastructure point of view. And then mining of atomic minerals, mining of iron ore, copper, lead, zinc. So these kind of activities were reserved for the public sector enterprise. Again, it was also thought that the PSUs which are not being very profitable, there would be a gradual disinvestment in them, which means that the government decided that they would be offloading their share to the extent of 20%. So from a minimum of 5% to a maximum of 20% of the shares, they had to be offloaded, they had to be sold away to private enterprises. Why? The reason was, first thing, this will bring in more resources for the government, because when they sell their stake, naturally they would sell it at a price, and they would be able to obtain that return for their share from the people who are willing to purchase their shares, or from the entities who are willing to purchase their shares. So naturally they would sell away their shares in return of some money. So this would be the way in which the government would be able to raise some resources. And secondly, it was also expected that once 5 to 20% of the shares of a company they are freely available for investors to purchase or to sell in the market. People would start purchasing them, and this would instill a market discipline in these firms. Why? Because if, let's say, some of your shares are being traded in the market, you would certainly want to perform well, because if you don't perform well, your shares will not be demanded anymore. There would be a drop in demand for your shares in the stock market, and people would start selling your shares, and eventually the share prices would decline. On the other hand, if you perform well, then there would be an increase in your share prices. So naturally, if some of shares are getting traded in the market, they are available for trade in the market, naturally this would instill market discipline, in the sense that you would want to perform more efficiently, you would want to increase your profit earnings, you would want to be more efficient in your operations, so that the shares that are there in the market, their prices don't decline and they continue to be demanded by the potential investors. So this was one idea that was behind disinvesting the PSUs, disinvesting a little bit of government stake in the PSUs. Then, however, there was a different policy for the loss-making PSUs. It was thought that initially, first they would be referred to Board of Industrial and Financial Reconstruction. Now, this was an organization which was supposed to revive these PSUs, these sick PSUs, these loss-making PSUs, to nurse them back into health, to bring them back into black, to make them profitable again, to make them viable again. So this was the job of the BIFR. So it was thought that if the PSUs are not able to generate sufficient profits, they would be referred to BIFR, so that BIFR can come up with a plan to nurse these sick PSUs back to health. And it was also thought that in case of those PSUs in which it is going to be very difficult to nurse them back into health, to make them viable again, such PSUs would be then privatized, which meant that they would be sold to private enterprises, one single private enterprise or maybe a consortium of different private enterprises. So this was the policy for the loss-making PSUs. If there is a reasonable chance of their becoming viable again, refer them to BIFR, and if there is no such chance, no such probability, then simply sell them off to private enterprises. So that was the policy regarding the public sector enterprises. And as far as the PSUs which were performing well, they were to be given more autonomy, so that they don't have to come and seek permission from the government for every single business decision. Autonomy in the sense that they were allowed to take the decisions on their own without having to seek government's approval for all the decisions. So it was thought that these profit-making enterprises, they are doing well, so let us provide them more autonomy. Let them be free to take business decisions without worrying about government's approval. So this was the policy that was unveiled with respect to the profit-making PSUs. Apart from that, the PSUs which are in the high priority sector, they were also to be given management autonomy. So you can see here that the PSUs, there was a policy of differential treatment to PSUs. The ones which were making profits, they had to be provided more incentives, they had to be given more autonomy. The ones who were making losses, they had to be either referred to the BIFR as seen here, or they had to be privatized. And then the ones who were doing okay, they were not performing really great, or they were not having great losses, they were not incurring great losses. For them, it was thought that a little bit of the shares of the government in such PSUs would be offloaded. So there would be a disinvestment in these kind of PSUs. So these were the policies unveiled in Industrial Policy 1991 as far as the public sector enterprises are concerned. As far as the licensing regime is concerned, you know that licensing basically refers to seeking approval for setting up an business enterprise, and this approval is sought from the government. However, in Industrial Policy 1991, most of the sectors were delicensed. What does this mean? This means that the requirement for licenses was withdrawn from these sectors. These sectors no more required any kind of licensing. Firms were free to set up their enterprises, to set up their units, and to produce in whatever quantity they want. So this kind of delicensing also took place in Industrial Policy 1991, and this is a feature of liberalization. This basically freed the Indian economy from the clutches of bureaucratic control and excessive regulations. Now see, licensing regime was limited to just 18 sectors. So the licensing regime was still there, but now the scope was limited to 18 sectors. Earlier there were so many sectors in which if you want to operate you need to seek license, but now licenses from 1991 onwards would only be required in these 18 sectors. These 18 sectors included sectors which are strategically very important for the country, which have a bearing on environmental safety, which if unchecked can lead to degradation of environment, and which included those luxury items which required high import content. Now the idea here in this particular case was, we did not want to use or just fritter away our forex reserves to buy those items which were not necessity goods, to buy those items which are basically luxury items and they had high import content. Naturally this meant that to produce these luxury items you had to import the raw material, and this would have been a waste of our forex reserves. So such luxury items which required high import content, if a company is producing these kind of luxury items, they had to go for licensing. However, in all other sectors there was no more any need for licensing. There was no more any need to seek government approval before starting operations. Now have a look at the sectors which were still under the licensing regime, in which if you want to operate as a firm you still need to seek license from the government, and these are the sectors. Now have a look at the petroleum and distillation products. Have a look at the drugs and pharmaceuticals. Now these were those sectors which were strategically very important for the government. Petroleum, because many of our industries run on petroleum products, on petrol or diesel. If there's a problem with availability of these refinery products, then it would cause a lot of issue to these industries. So they were strategically very important. Apart from that, have a look at the drugs and pharmaceutical. Again, very important to keep your citizens healthy, and that is why these sectors were basically considered to be strategically vital, and that is why the licensing regime was retained in these sectors. So if a company wants to set up an enterprise in these sectors, they had to still seek license from the government. On the other hand, there were sectors like the industrial explosives and the hazardous chemicals. Have a look at tanned or dressed fur skins. Now these were those sectors which, if not monitored closely, if not regulated closely, could cause a lot of environment degradation, could pollute the environment, and that is why licensing was retained in these kind of sectors as well. And then as far as the luxury items are concerned, you can have a look at the entertainment electronic items including TV, tape recorder at that point of time. Then you've got the motor cars, we have got the white goods or the consumer durables. Now these were all luxury items, they were not basic necessities, and the government didn't want its meager forex resources to be spent on these kind of wasteful consumption, right? So these were the sectors which were retained under the licensing regime. Now please understand the last line that you see here. Now these were those industries in which the licensing regime was revoked later in the same decade, around 93-94. So these three industries were the ones in which the licensing regime was revoked and they were delicensed later. So these were the 3 industries which were delicensed later, which meant that after 95-96 we only had 15 sectors in which licensing was still required in our country. So this was the extent of liberalization that happened. This was the extent of freedom which was given to the business enterprises post 1991. Now have a look at the industrial policy 1991's trade liberalization aspects. How did it made it easier to trade across the borders? And in that sense, how did it contribute to integrate our economy with the world economy? To integrate the Indian economy with the world economy. Import licenses were replaced by exempt scrips. Earlier, before 1991, the government used to give away licenses for imports, which determined how much, what type, what quality of import would be taking place and what would be the quantity that would be imported. Naturally, we wanted to keep our forex reserve safe. So this was one reason. And so there was licenses. There used to be licenses before 1991 in which these things used to be mentioned. The quality, the quantity, the specification. Now this regime was changed in 1991 and the replacement were the exempt scrips. Exempt stands for export-import scrips. Now what do you mean by exempt scrips? They were export-linked import entitlements. What does this mean? I'll give you a crude example just to make you understand. Export-linked import entitlements basically means that suppose you are exporting, let's say 100 kilogram of a particular good, right? And suppose you fetch $100 by exporting these goods in the international market. You fetch 100 rupees for this, you are able to earn $100 for this, sorry. Now these $100 are in a way government's foreign exchange earning. Now a particular percentage of this export, the $100 export that you have been able to make, so a particular percentage of these export you would be allowed to import also. So how much you can import would depend on how much you have exported. So depending on the quantity of your exports, a particular quantity of imports would be allowed to you. So if let's say you are exporting goods worth $100, you may import goods worth 40% of $100, let's say $40. So this is what we mean by export linked import entitlements. So if you want to import more, what will you have to do? You will have to export more. The more you export, the greater can you import. So this was the whole idea behind exempt scrips, and the exempt scrips basically replace the import license regime which existed till then. Then the liberalized import authorization regime replaced canalization. Canalization basically refers to the practice of giving away the licenses for imports of particular commodities to only a few importers. So earlier, only a few importers were given away the licenses to import various commodities. Now that system was done away with, and it was easier for importers to get authorization for importing these commodities. So there was no more canalization after 1991. Then as far as the maximum amount that can be imported in case of capital goods, that was also raised. The ceilings were raised as far as import of capital goods was concerned, and that was pretty natural because ultimately capital goods are not meant for consumption, they are meant for use in some commercial activity. So the government raised the maximum amount that can be spent on importing of these kind of capital goods. Again, one more trade liberalization provision which was there was the trading firms which were mainly engaged in exporting goods from India to foreign countries. They were allowed to have majority foreign ownership. So these trading firms were now allowed to have majority ownership by some foreign national if they were engaged in exports What was the whole objective behind this kind of provision? The whole objective was that if a particular trading firm is exporting to different countries and is bringing in forex reserves for you, foreign exchange for you, then let us make it easier for these kind of trading firms to operate. And to do that, we relaxed the ownership requirements for these kind of firms, and they were allowed to have majority foreign ownership. For foreign technology agreements in high priority sectors, automatic approval was to be given after 1991. Before that, if you are entering into agreements to obtain foreign technology from some foreign country so that you can use it here in India, you required permission from the government, because when you are importing these kind of technologies, naturally you have to pay something, and when you pay something, it will ultimately reduce your forex reserve to that extent, and government was very keen to preserve its forex reserve. So there was this provision before 1991 that whenever you are trying to import such technologies or you are inviting some skilled personnel from outside, you will have to take prior approval of the government. But this particular provision was also done away with. Now, if you are importing some technology for high priority sectors, you didn't need to go for approval from the government, and the approval was deemed to be automatic. So automatic approval was allowed. Likewise, I said, for the foreign technicians and foreign experts and testing facilities, if they are in the high priority sector and you want to import them, you as a firm, as a company, would be given automatic approval. You don't have to seek government's approval for engaging in these kind of imports. Again, naturally, when you are buying some technology from outside, or when you are using some technology developed in a foreign country, you would have to pay loyalty for that. We have discussed this in intellectual property rights that we discussed in international business. So naturally you have to pay royalties. Till 1991 there was a limit to how much royalty can you pay for the foreign technology that you have used, which is basically a property of some foreign firm. So how much royalty can you pay to that foreign firm? There was an upper limit to that. But now, after 1991, what happened? Higher royalty payments were allowed for buying or for using foreign technology also. So these were the changes which were brought about as far as India's international trade was concerned, India's trade and export and imports were concerned. So these were the changes which were brought about in Industrial Policy 1991. Now, friends, we will take up some more aspects of Industrial Policy of 1991 in the next session. Till then, it is expected of you to go through the session that we have had today again and again until you are able to make sense of everything that we have discussed. In case you come across any problem, you can always post a query. Thank you.